The stagecoach door swung open with a groan of protest, and Sheriff Asher Jameson looked up from his position outside the general store, just in time to see her emerge into the harsh afternoon sunlight of Bentonville, Arkansas, looking like she had crossed through hell itself. Her traveling dress, once probably a respectable shade of blue, was now coated in a thick layer of red dust that clung to every inch of fabric, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins during what must have been a brutal journey. She stepped down onto the wooden platform, her legs unsteady after the long ride, and immediately began coughing from the dust that seemed to billow around her like a personal storm cloud. Without thinking twice, Asher crossed the dirt road in 4 long strides, unclipping the canteen from his belt as he moved. "Here," he said, offering the metal container to her before she could even get her bearings. "You look like you could use this more than I can right now." The woman looked up at him with eyes the color of rich earth, surprise flickering across her dust-covered face. She hesitated for just a moment before accepting the canteen with trembling fingers, and when she tilted it back to drink, Asher noticed the graceful line of her throat despite the grime. She drank deeply, not bothering with ladylike sips, and he respected her for it. This was Arkansas in June of 1878, and the heat was merciless. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice hoarse but melodic underneath the roughness. "That was the worst journey I have ever endured. The driver kept saying it would smooth out, but I swear we hit every rock and rut between here and Little Rock." Asher found himself smiling, something he did not do often enough these days. Old Tom likes to take the scenic route, which usually means the most uncomfortable one. "I am Asher Jameson, sheriff of this fine town." "Zelda Rayburn," she replied, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, which only served to smear the dust around more. "I am supposed to be meeting with Mr. Harrison about a teaching position at the schoolhouse, but I am afraid I look entirely unpresentable." A school teacher. That explained the trunk being unloaded from the top of the stage, presumably filled with books and proper dresses, and whatever else an educated woman might bring to a frontier town. Asher had heard that the school board had finally found someone willing to take on the 30 or so children who needed educating, but he had not expected someone who looked quite like this. Even covered in road dust, Zelda Rayburn had a quality about her that made his chest feel strangely tight. "The boarding house is just down the street," he told her, gesturing toward a 2-story building with a fresh coat of whitewash. "Mrs. Fletcher runs it, and she will have a room ready for you. I suspect Mr. Harrison will understand if you want to clean up before any official meetings." Zelda looked at him with such gratitude that Asher felt something shift inside him, like a door he had kept locked for years suddenly creaking open. "That would be wonderful. I must look absolutely frightful." "You look like someone who just survived a Arkansas stagecoach ride," Asher said, surprising himself with the gentle teasing in his tone. "Which is to say, you look like a warrior." A smile broke across her face, transforming it completely despite the dust, and Asher knew in that moment he was in serious trouble. He had been sheriff of Bentonville for 3 years, ever since he turned 22, and in all that time he had kept himself focused on the work, on keeping the peace in a town that balanced on the edge between civilization and wildness. Romance had seemed like a luxury he could not afford, especially after watching his own parents tear each other apart with bitterness and resentment. But standing here in the June heat with a dusty schoolteacher smiling at him like he had just offered her the world instead of a simple canteen of water, Asher felt his carefully maintained walls beginning to crumble. "Let me help you with your trunk," he offered, already moving toward where the driver had deposited the heavy piece of luggage. "You do not have to do that," Zelda protested, but she was already following him, her steps still a bit unsteady on solid ground. "I know I do not have to," Asher said, hefting the trunk onto his shoulder with practiced ease. "But Mrs. Fletcher is 3 doors down, and I happen to be headed in that direction anyway." It was a lie, of course. He had been planning to check on the situation at the saloon, where 2 cowboys had been getting increasingly rowdy over a card game, but that could wait. The cowboys would either settle down or escalate, and either way, they would still be there in 20 minutes. They walked together down the wooden sidewalk, and Asher found himself acutely aware of every detail about the woman beside him. She was not tall, probably reaching only to his shoulder, but she carried herself with a straightness that suggested inner strength. Her dress might be ruined by dust, but the cut of it suggested quality, and he wondered what had brought a woman of obvious education and refinement to a town like Bentonville. "Have you been sheriff here long?" Zelda asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. 3 years, Asher replied. "Took over when Sheriff Daniels retired. He said he was tired of getting shot at, which I understood completely after my first week." Zelda glanced at him with concern. "Is it very dangerous here?" "No more than any other town trying to figure out what it wants to be," Asher said honestly. "We get some trouble on Saturday nights when the ranch hands come in to spend their pay, and occasionally we have issues with outlaws passing through. But mostly it is keeping the peace between neighbors who cannot seem to remember that fences are meant to stay put and cattle are meant to stay on the right side of them." They had reached the boarding house, and Asher climbed the steps to knock on the door. It swung open almost immediately, revealing Mrs. Fletcher, a formidable woman in her 50s who ran the establishment with an iron will wrapped in maternal warmth. "Sheriff Jameson," she said, then her eyes landed on Zelda and widened. "Oh my stars, you must be Miss Rayburn. We got the telegram saying you would be arriving today, but I did not expect you to look quite so traveled." "The journey was challenging," Zelda said diplomatically, and Asher had to suppress a smile at her understatement. Come in," Mrs. Fletcher said, ushering them both inside. "I have a room all ready for you, and I will have hot water sent up immediately. You will want a proper bath after that ordeal." Asher set the trunk down in the entry hall, and when he straightened, he found Zelda looking at him with those warm, earth-colored eyes again. "Thank you, Sheriff Jameson," she said softly, "for the water and the help and the kindness. It means more than you might think." "Asher," he heard himself say. "You can call me Asher." "Then you must call me Zelda," she replied, and the smile she gave him this time felt like a promise of something he did not yet have words for. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and stepped back out into the afternoon heat, but his mind was no longer on rowdy cowboys or fence disputes. Instead, he found himself thinking about dust-covered schoolteachers with gentle smiles and wondering how quickly a man could fall in love with a woman he had just met. The answer, he was beginning to suspect, was frighteningly fast. 2 days later, Asher found himself walking past the schoolhouse for the 3rd time that morning, which was ridiculous considering he had no official business anywhere near the small wooden building at the edge of town. But he had heard from Mrs. Fletcher that Zelda had spent the previous day meeting with Mr. Harrison and the other members of the school board, and he was curious about how it had gone. He was not prepared to see her outside the building, on her hands and knees scrubbing the wooden steps with a bucket of soapy water, and more determination than he had seen in most men facing down armed outlaws. "I thought school teachers were supposed to teach," he called out, unable to stop himself from approaching. Zelda looked up, pushing a strand of hair back from her face with her forearm to avoid getting soap on it. She was wearing a simple brown dress with the sleeves rolled up, and he could see the muscles in her arms flex as she scrubbed. There was something deeply appealing about seeing a refined woman willing to do hard physical work. "School teachers are supposed to provide an environment conducive to learning," she replied, sitting back on her heels. "And this schoolhouse has apparently been closed for 6 months while they searched for someone willing to take the position. It needs a thorough cleaning before any children set foot inside." Asher looked at the building with new eyes, noticing the dust coating the windows and the cobwebs gathering in the corners of the doorframe. "Where is the school board? Seems like they should be helping with this." "They are all busy men with farms and businesses to run," Zelda said, but there was a thread of frustration in her voice. "They were very grateful that I accepted the position, and very clear that part of my responsibilities included maintaining the facility." Something hot and protective flared in Asher's chest. He knew every member of that school board, and while they were decent enough men, they were also perfectly capable of taking advantage of a woman who had traveled hundreds of miles and had no other options. "That seems like asking a lot for the salary they are paying," he said carefully. Zelda's smile was wry. "The salary they are paying is barely enough to cover my room and board with a little left over for necessities. But I needed to leave St. Louis, and this position was available, so here I am." There was a story there, Asher could tell, but he did not press. Instead, he removed his hat and set it carefully on the porch railing. "Well, you should not have to do this alone. Point me toward another brush." "Sheriff, you cannot possibly," Zelda started to protest, but Asher was already rolling up his sleeves. "Why not? I am reasonably certain the town is not going to descend into chaos in the next few hours. Besides, my deputy is more than capable of handling things." He found another scrub brush inside the building, along with evidence of just how much work needed to be done. Desks were covered in dust, the wood stove was full of old ash, and there were signs that mice had made themselves at home during the building's vacancy. But he said nothing about it, just filled another bucket with water from the pump outside and got to work on the other half of the steps. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the scrubbing of brushes against wood and the distant noise of the town going about its business. Asher found himself stealing glances at Zelda when he thought she was not looking, admiring the concentration on her face and the efficient way she moved. "Why did you need to leave St. Louis?" he finally asked, keeping his voice casual. Zelda paused in her scrubbing, and for a moment he thought she was not going to answer. Then she sighed and sat back again, looking out at the town instead of at him. "I was engaged to be married," she said quietly, "to a man my parents very much approved of. He was a banker, very successful, very proper. We had known each other since childhood, and everyone assumed we would eventually marry." Asher felt his jaw tighten at the mention of an engagement, but he forced himself to remain silent and let her continue. "3 months before the wedding, I discovered he was keeping a mistress," Zelda continued, her voice steady but laced with old pain. "When I confronted him, he told me it was none of my concern, that what he did before the marriage had no bearing on what came after. And when I said I could not marry a man who saw fidelity as optional, he told me I was being childish and unrealistic." "He sounds like a fool," Asher said bluntly. Zelda looked at him with surprise, then laughed, a real laugh that seemed to lighten the shadows in her eyes. "My parents thought I was the fool. They said I was throwing away security and respectability over something that did not matter. They gave me a choice: marry Charles as planned or leave their house and make my own way." "So you left," Asher said, understanding dawning. "So I left," Zelda confirmed. "I had teaching credentials and enough money saved to get me started somewhere new. I applied to every school board in every small town I could find in the Western Territories and states. Bentonville was the first to offer me a position. Asher thought about what it must have taken for her to walk away from everything she knew, everyone she knew, to maintain her principles. Most people would have compromised, would have convinced themselves that security was more important than respect. But Zelda had chosen the harder path, and he admired her more than he could easily express. "Their loss is Bentonville's gain," he said, meeting her eyes directly. She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, something electric and undeniable. Then Zelda broke eye contact first, a faint blush coloring her cheeks despite the fact that she was 24 years old and had been engaged to be married. "We should finish these steps," she said, but her voice was softer than before, almost shy. They worked together for the rest of the morning, moving from the steps to the interior of the building. Asher found himself telling her about the town, pointing out which families had children who would be in her class, warning her about which parents might be difficult and which would be supportive. Zelda listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and taking mental notes. By the time the sun was high overhead, they had made significant progress. The steps gleamed, the windows were clear, and the interior smelled of soap and fresh air instead of dust and mice. "I should let you get back to your duties," Zelda said reluctantly as they stood on the porch surveying their work. "You have already given me far more of your time than I had any right to expect." "I will come back tomorrow," Asher heard himself say. "That wood stove needs proper cleaning and the chimney probably needs sweeping. I have the tools for that at the jail." "Asher, you do not have to," Zelda protested, but he could see the hope in her eyes. "I know I do not have to," he said, echoing his words from 2 days earlier. "But I want to." "Unless you would prefer to do it alone." "No," Zelda said quickly. "I mean, your help would be very much appreciated, if you are certain it is not too much trouble." "It is no trouble at all," Asher assured her and meant it completely. He walked her back to the boarding house, carrying the buckets and brushes, and tried to ignore the knowing look Mrs. Fletcher gave him when she opened the door. The older woman had been trying to match him with various eligible young ladies since he took the position as sheriff, but he had always politely declined her attempts at matchmaking. This time, though, he suspected his interest was written clearly across his face. That evening, as he sat in his small office at the jail, ostensibly going over reports but actually staring at the wall and thinking about earth-colored eyes and determined smiles, his deputy walked in with a grin. "Heard you spent the morning scrubbing floors at the schoolhouse," Deputy Miller said, settling into the chair across from Asher's desk. "That is a new one even for you." "The new teacher needed help," Asher said defensively. "The school board left her with a mess." "Uh-huh," Miller said, his grin widening. "And the fact that the new teacher is young and pretty has nothing to do with your sudden interest in educational facilities. She is intelligent and principled and deserving of respect," Asher said firmly. "The fact that she is also attractive is irrelevant." "Right," Miller said. "Well, for what it is worth, I think it is good to see you interested in something other than wanted posters and property disputes. You are 25 years old, Asher. You are allowed to have a life outside this badge." Asher looked down at the silver star pinned to his chest, thinking about how much of his identity had become wrapped up in this job. He had used it as an excuse to avoid connection, to keep people at a safe distance, where they could not hurt him the way his parents had hurt each other. But Zelda was different. She had already been hurt and had chosen to start over rather than settle for less than she deserved. That took a kind of courage he could not help but respect. "Maybe you are right," he admitted quietly. "Course I am right," Miller said, standing up and stretching. Now go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow you have a wood stove to clean, apparently." Asher did go home, to the small house he rented on the quiet end of town, but sleep was slow to come. He kept thinking about the way Zelda had laughed when he called her former fiancé a fool, the way she had looked at him when he offered to help again tomorrow, the way his heart had stuttered when their hands accidentally brushed as they both reached for the same bucket. He was falling in love with her. It was ridiculous and impractical and probably too fast to be sensible, but it was happening anyway. The only question now was whether she felt anything similar and whether he had the courage to find out. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern that became the highlight of Asher's days. Every morning after checking in at the jail and making sure the night had passed without incident, he would head to the schoolhouse where Zelda would already be working. Together they repaired desks, patched the roof where it had started to leak, and swept out every corner until the building was transformed. But more than the physical work, they talked. Asher found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, about his parents' bitter marriage that had ended when his mother left for California without warning, about his decision to take the sheriff position, as a way to prove he could be better than the chaos he came from. Zelda told him about growing up in St. Louis society, about the suffocating expectations and the relief she felt at finally being free of them, even if that freedom came with uncertainty and hard work. "You ever regret it?" Asher asked one afternoon as they sat on the schoolhouse steps taking a break, leaving everything behind. Zelda was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the easy parts. Having a full wardrobe, not having to worry about money, knowing exactly what each day would bring. But then I think about what I would have had to sacrifice for that comfort, and no, I do not regret it. I would rather struggle and be true to myself than live a lie in comfort." "That takes strength," Asher said, looking at her with open admiration. "Or stubbornness," Zelda replied with a smile. "My mother always said I was too stubborn for my own good." "I think your mother was wrong," Asher said. "I think your stubbornness is your greatest asset." The way she looked at him then made his breath catch. There was warmth in her eyes and something deeper, something that might have been the beginning of love. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, wanted to tell her that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever met, wanted to kiss her right there on the schoolhouse steps in broad daylight where anyone could see. But he held back, unsure if she was ready for such declarations. She had been hurt badly by her former fiancé, and the last thing he wanted was to push too hard too fast and scare her away. The schoolhouse was finally ready on a Saturday morning in early July, just 2 weeks before classes were scheduled to begin. Asher stood in the center of the main room, looking at the neat rows of desks, the clean windows letting in golden light, the chalkboard freshly painted and ready for use. It was a far cry from the dusty, neglected building it had been when Zelda first arrived. "We did it," Zelda said softly, standing beside him. "I could not have managed this without you. You would have found a way," Asher assured her, "but I am glad I could help." There was a moment of silence, heavy with things unsaid, and Asher knew he had to speak before his courage failed him. He turned to face her fully, taking off his hat and holding it in his hands. "Zelda, I need to tell you something," he began, his heart pounding hard enough he was sure she must be able to hear it. "Asher," she interrupted gently, and when he looked at her face, he saw that she was smiling. "If you are about to say what I think you are about to say, you should know that I feel the same way." Hope surged through him. "You do?" "I have been falling in love with you since the moment you offered me your canteen," Zelda said, her voice trembling slightly but her eyes steady. "You have been nothing but kind and respectful and good, and every day I spend with you makes me more certain that you are the man I have been waiting for all my life." Asher closed the distance between them, setting his hat on a nearby desk so he could take both of her hands in his. "I love you, Zelda Rayburn. I know it is fast, and I know you have been hurt before, but I swear to you that I will never give you cause to doubt my faithfulness or my devotion. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met, and if you will give me the chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of you." Tears were streaming down Zelda's face, but she was smiling wider than he had ever seen. "You do not have to prove anything, Asher Jameson. You already showed me who you are through your actions. And yes, I will give you that chance because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." He kissed her then, soft and gentle and full of promise, and it felt like coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Zelda laughed with pure joy. "The whole town is going to be talking about us," she said. "Let them talk," Asher replied, pulling her close again. "I am courting the school teacher, and I intend to marry her as soon as she will have me." "Courting requires a certain amount of time and proper behavior," Zelda said, but her eyes were dancing with amusement. "Then I will court you properly," Asher promised. "Dinners and walks and attending church socials together. Whatever you want, whatever you need to feel certain." "I am already certain," Zelda said softly, "but I like the idea of being courted by you anyway." News of their relationship spread through Bentonville exactly as quickly as Zelda had predicted. By Monday morning, everyone in town seemed to know that the sheriff was courting the new school teacher, and opinions were divided. Mrs. Fletcher was delighted, claiming she had seen the connection from the very first day. The school board members were cautiously approving, though Mr. Harrison made a point of telling Asher that he expected Zelda to fulfill her teaching contract even after marriage. Some of the older ladies at church clucked their tongues about how fast things were moving, while the younger folks thought it was romantic. Asher did not care what anyone thought. He was too happy to let gossip bother him. He courted Zelda the way she deserved, with attention and respect and genuine affection. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, where they sat across from each other and talked until the staff started giving them pointed looks about closing time. He walked with her in the evenings after she finished preparing lessons, showing her the parts of town and the surrounding countryside that he loved. He attended church with her on Sundays, sitting in the pew and listening to her clear voice during the hymns and thinking about how lucky he was. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Sitting on Mrs. Fletcher's porch in the evening, talking about their days. Stealing kisses in the shadow of the schoolhouse when he walked her home after working late. The way she would bring him lunch at the jail when she knew he was dealing with something difficult. Never asking questions, but just being there with her steady presence. 3 weeks after the schoolhouse was finished, classes began. Asher made a point of being there on the first day, ostensibly to make sure everything went smoothly, but really just wanting to see Zelda in her element. She was magnificent, commanding the attention of 30 children ranging from 6 to 14 with patience and enthusiasm and genuine love for teaching. He watched from the back of the room as she welcomed each child by name, having memorized all of them before the first day, and saw the way the children responded to her warmth. "You are good at this," he told her that evening as they walked along the creek that ran behind the town. "I love it," Zelda admitted. "Even the difficult parts. Today Johnny Miller threw a frog at Sarah Henderson, and I had to keep from laughing while I disciplined him. But seeing their faces when they understand something new when learning clicks for them, it makes everything worthwhile." "You are making a difference here," Asher said seriously. "These children needed someone who cared, and you do." They had stopped walking, standing under a cottonwood tree with the evening light filtering through the leaves. Zelda looked up at him with so much love in her eyes that it took his breath away. "I love you, Asher," she said. "I know I have said it before, but I want you to know that it gets stronger every day. You have given me a home here, not just in Bentonville but in your heart, and I have never been happier." Asher knew this was the moment. He had been carrying his mother's ring in his pocket for the past week, waiting for the right time. It was a simple gold band with a small sapphire, one of the few things she had left behind when she abandoned the family. He had considered selling it over the years, but something had always stopped him. Now he understood why. It had been waiting for Zelda. He dropped to one knee right there by the creek, pulling the ring from his pocket and holding it up to her. Zelda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Zelda Rayburn, will you marry me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Will you let me love you and protect you and stand beside you for the rest of our lives? I know I am just a small town sheriff without much to offer, but I promise you that I will work every day to make you happy and to give you the life you deserve." "Yes," Zelda said, tears streaming down her face again. "Yes, of course I will marry you, and you are wrong, Asher. You have everything to offer. You have yourself, and that is all I need." He slipped the ring onto her finger, grateful when it fit perfectly, and then stood and swept her into his arms. They kissed like they were the only two people in the world, like nothing else mattered but this moment and this love and this promise of a future together. They were married in September, 6 months after Zelda had stepped off that dusty stagecoach and into Asher's life. The ceremony took place in the small church on the edge of town, with what felt like the entire population of Bentonville in attendance. Zelda wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and Asher wore his best suit with his sheriff badge polished to a high shine. Mrs. Fletcher cried through the entire ceremony, and even gruff Mr. Harrison looked a bit misty-eyed. But all Asher could see was Zelda, radiant and beautiful in his, promising to love and honor him all the days of her life. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told him he could kiss his bride, Asher did so with his whole heart, sealing the promise they had made to each other. The reception was held in the schoolhouse, which seemed fitting given that was where their love had truly grown. There was food and music and dancing, and Asher waltzed with his wife under the same roof where they had scrubbed floors and cleaned windows together just months before. "Happy," he murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Zelda replied, leaning into him. "Who knew that running away from a bad situation would lead me to the best thing that ever happened to me?" They spent their wedding night in the small house Asher had been renting, which would now be their home together. Zelda had already moved her belongings from the boarding house, and seeing her things mixed with his made the space feel complete in a way it never had before. "I love you, Mrs. Jameson," Asher whispered as they lay together in the darkness, wrapped in each other's arms. "I love you too, Mr. Jameson," Zelda replied, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "Today was perfect." "Today was just the beginning," Asher said. "We have the rest of our lives ahead of us." And what a life it turned out to be. Zelda continued teaching, becoming beloved in the community for her dedication and care. Asher continued as sheriff, keeping the peace and protecting the town he had come to think of as truly home for the first time in his life. Together they built a life based on mutual respect, deep love, and genuine partnership. A year after their wedding, Zelda told him she was pregnant. Asher was terrified and elated in equal measure, worried about becoming a father when his own childhood had been so chaotic, but determined to do better than his parents had done. Their son was born in June of 1879, right as the school year ended. They named him Samuel, after Zelda's grandfather, and from the moment Asher held the tiny, squalling infant in his arms, he understood what it meant to love someone completely and unconditionally. Zelda was magnificent as a mother, just as she was magnificent at everything else, nursing their son while grading papers and somehow making it all look easy even though Asher knew it was exhausting. "You are incredible," he told her one night as she rocked Samuel back to sleep after a feeding. "I do not know how you do it all. I do not do it alone," Zelda said, smiling at him. "You are right here with me, sharing the load. That makes all the difference." It was true. Asher changed diapers and walked the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night and learned to function on less sleep than he had ever imagined possible. But he would not have traded it for anything. This was his family, his wife and his son, and protecting them was more important than any duty he had as sheriff. When Samuel was 6 months old, trouble came to Bentonville in the form of the Clayton Gang, a group of outlaws who had been robbing banks and stagecoaches across Arkansas and Missouri. They rode into town on a cold November morning, 4 hard-faced men who took over the saloon and made it clear they planned to rob the bank the next day. Asher was at the jail when word reached him, and his first thought was of Zelda and Samuel at home. He sent Deputy Miller to watch over them while he dealt with the situation, knowing that he had to act before the gang made good on their threat. He confronted them that evening at the saloon, walking in alone because he did not want to risk anyone else getting hurt. The leader, a man named Jack Clayton, looked him up and down with amusement. "You are the law in this town?" Clayton asked, laughing. "Just you and that puppy of a deputy I saw earlier. Just me is enough," Asher said calmly, though his heart was racing. "You and your men need to leave Bentonville. Now, tonight, or what?" Clayton challenged, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You will shoot all 4 of us." "I do not think so, Sheriff." Asher was acutely aware that the saloon had gone silent, everyone watching to see what would happen. He was also aware that he was outgunned and outmanned, but he had something the Clayton gang did not have, a reason to stay alive and fight for what mattered. "I will give you one chance to leave peacefully," Asher said, his voice carrying through the room. "After that, I will do whatever it takes to protect this town and everyone in it. Your choice." For a long moment, the tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Then Clayton laughed again, but this time there was less humor in it. "You have guts, Sheriff, I will give you that," he said. "But we are not leaving. We came here to rob that bank, and that is what we are going to do." Asher knew he could not win in a direct confrontation, but he did not have to. He just had to buy time and be smarter than they were. Over the next 24 hours, Asher organized the town in a way he never had before. He deputized 10 men he trusted, positioned them around the bank and the main street, and made sure everyone knew the plan. When the Clayton gang tried to rob the bank the following afternoon, they found themselves surrounded by armed townspeople who were not going to let their community be victimized. The confrontation was tense, but ended without bloodshed. Clayton, seeing that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, chose to surrender rather than die. Asher locked them in the jail cells and telegraphed for the federal marshal, who arrived 2 days later to take them for trial. When it was over and the gang was gone, Asher went home to his wife and son and held them both close, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. "I was so scared," Zelda admitted, her face pressed against his chest. "When Deputy Miller told me what was happening, all I could think was that I might lose you." "You will never lose me," Asher promised. "I will always come home to you and Samuel, always." It was a promise he kept for the next 47 years. As time passed, their family grew. Zelda gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret in 1881. And another son they named Thomas in 1883. The house expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Asher found himself becoming a different kind of protector, one who worried about scraped knees and childhood fevers as much as he worried about keeping the peace in Bentonville. Zelda taught for 12 years before deciding to stay home full-time with the children. She poured her energy into raising them with the same dedication she had brought to teaching, instilling in them her values of education, integrity, and compassion. Asher watched his children grow up loved and secure, everything he had never been as a child, and felt a fierce pride in what he and Zelda had built together. Samuel grew up to become a lawyer, moving to Little Rock to practice but visiting often with his own family. Margaret became a teacher like her mother, taking over the Bentonville schoolhouse when the previous teacher retired. Thomas decided to follow in his father's footsteps, becoming a deputy sheriff, and eventually taking over as sheriff when Asher retired. Asher served as sheriff of Bentonville for 32 years, finally hanging up his badge at the age of 57. By then, the town had grown from a rough frontier settlement into a thriving community with paved streets, electric lights, and a railroad connection. He and Zelda had been part of that growth, contributing to the transformation through their dedication and service. In retirement, Asher spent his days working in the garden, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with Zelda, talking about everything and nothing the way they had since the beginning. She was silver-haired now and moved a bit slower than she once had, but to Asher she was as beautiful as the day she stepped off that stagecoach covered in dust. "You ever think about what would have happened if I had not come to Bentonville?" Zelda asked him one evening as they watched the sunset together. "Every day," Asher admitted. "And every day I am grateful that you did. You changed my life, Zelda. You showed me what love could be, what family could be. Everything good in my life came from that moment when I offered you my canteen." "It was always meant to be," Zelda said, lacing her fingers through his. "You were waiting for me and I was searching for you, and somehow we found each other in this little corner of Arkansas. That is not coincidence. That is fate." They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The whole town turned out for the party, honoring the couple who had become pillars of the community. Asher looked around at the faces of the people they had influenced, the lives they had touched, and felt a sense of completeness he had never imagined possible. Zelda passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1926, at the age of 72. Asher held her hand as she took her last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude for the 50 years they had shared. The grief was crushing, like losing part of himself, but he took comfort in knowing that she had lived a full, happy life surrounded by people who loved her. He followed her 2 years later at the age of 75. His last thoughts were of that June day in 1878, when a dusty schoolteacher had accepted his canteen and smiled at him like he had offered her the world. In a way, he had, and she had given him one in return. They were buried side by side in the Bentonville cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, "Asher and Zelda Jameson, beloved husband and wife, parents and friends, together always." And in the years that followed, when children attended school in the building that Asher and Zelda had cleaned together, when citizens walked streets that Asher had protected and Zelda had graced with her presence, when grandchildren told their own children about the sheriff and the schoolteacher who had loved each other from first sight, their story lived on. It was a story of courage and second chances, of finding love in unexpected places, of building a life based on respect and partnership and unwavering devotion. It was a story that reminded people that true love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth traveling across the country for. It was the story of how a cowboy with a badge offered his canteen to a woman covered in dust. and in that simple act of kindness, found everything he had been searching for without knowing it. It was the story of how Zelda Rayburn left behind a life of comfort and expectation to find genuine happiness in a frontier town. It was the story of two people who chose each other every single day for 50 years, through challenges and joys, struggles and triumphs. But more than anything, it was a love story. And love stories, especially the true ones, never really end. They just transform, becoming part of the fabric of a place, woven into the history and the memory until they become legend. And legends, as everyone knows, last forever. In the decades after their deaths, Bentonville continued to grow and change. The frontier town became a city, the dirt roads became highways, the simple buildings became modern structures. But the schoolhouse remained, preserved as a historical site where visitors could learn about the early days of education in Arkansas. And in that schoolhouse, there was a small plaque that told the story of Zelda Rayburn Jameson, who had arrived in 1878 and dedicated herself to teaching the children of Bentonville for 12 years before focusing on raising her own family. Next to the schoolhouse, there was a historical marker about Sheriff Asher Jameson, who had served the town for 32 years and was known for his integrity, his courage, and his dedication to justice. Tourists would read about how he had protected the town from the Clayton Gang, how he had helped establish the first town council, how he had been respected by everyone who knew him. But what the plaques and markers did not capture was the love. They did not tell about the way Asher's face would light up every time Zelda entered a room, even after 50 years of marriage. They did not describe how Zelda would always touch his hand when she passed his chair, a small gesture of connection and affection. They did not mention the letters they had written to each other during the rare times they were apart, full of longing and devotion and promises to return soon. Those details lived on in the memories of their descendants, passed down through the generations as a blueprint for what marriage could be at its best. Samuel told his children about how his parents had never gone to bed angry, how they had always talked through their disagreements with respect and patience. Margaret shared stories of her mother's strength and her father's gentleness, how they had balanced each other perfectly. Thomas spoke of the way his father had supported his mother's dreams, even when society said women should not have ambitions beyond their homes, and how his mother had stood beside his father through every challenge he faced as sheriff. These stories became part of the family legacy, shaping how the Jameson descendants approached their own relationships and their own lives. They understood that real love was not just passion and romance, though Asher and Zelda had certainly had both. Real love was also showing up every day, doing the work, choosing your partner over and over again even when it was hard. The house where Asher and Zelda had raised their children remained in the family for 3 generations, before finally being sold to a young couple who promised to preserve its history. They were newlyweds, full of hope and dreams about their own future, and when they learned the story of the home's original owners, they felt honored to be continuing the legacy of love that had begun there. In the garden behind that house, there was an old cottonwood tree that Asher had planted shortly after they married. It had been a sapling then, barely taller than Zelda. By the time they died, it had grown into a massive presence, providing shade for summer picnics and shelter for birds' nests. That tree still stood in the 21st century, a living testament to the life that had been planted alongside it all those years ago. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right through the cottonwood's leaves, people said they could almost hear laughter, the sound of children playing and parents watching with love and joy. Some dismissed it as imagination or nostalgia. But others, The ones who believed in the power of true love to transcend time and death knew better. They knew that some bonds were so strong they left an imprint on the world, an echo that could still be felt by those who were paying attention. The canteen that Asher had offered to Zelda on that dusty June day was passed down through the family as a cherished heirloom. It was displayed in a place of honor in Samuel's home, then Margaret's, then through the generations until it ended up in a museum exhibit about life in frontier Arkansas. The placard next to it told the basic facts. A standard military-issue canteen from the 1870s, used by Sheriff Asher Jameson of Bentonville. But those who knew the real story understood that it was so much more than that. It was the beginning of everything. It was the moment when kindness sparked connection, when a simple gesture of offering water to a thirsty traveler became the foundation for a lifetime of love and partnership. Visitors to the museum would look at the canteen, tarnished and dented from years of use, and see just an old piece of metal. But the Jameson descendants who came to visit saw their history, their heritage, their proof that love stories do not just happen in books and movies. They happen to real people in dusty frontier towns, to sheriffs with badges and schoolteachers with dreams, to anyone brave enough to open their heart and take a chance on connection. The story of Asher and Zelda Jameson became one of those tales that defined a place, that gave it character and depth beyond just buildings and streets. Bentonville was proud of its connection to this couple who had embodied the best of what the frontier could be: brave, principled, devoted, and loving. Their story was taught in local schools, featured in historical societies, and referenced whenever anyone talked about the town's founding families. But beyond the public recognition, beyond the historical markers and museum exhibits, the real legacy of Asher and Zelda's love was in how it changed the lives of everyone it touched. The children Zelda taught grew up knowing that education was valuable, that they were valued, because she had treated each one with care and attention. The people Asher protected as sheriff learned that justice could be administered with both strength and compassion, that law enforcement was about serving the community, not controlling it. Their children learned that marriage could be a partnership of equals, that men could be gentle and nurturing while still being strong, that women could be accomplished and independent while still choosing to share their lives with someone they loved. Their grandchildren learned that love was not something that faded with time, but something that deepened and grew richer with every year, every shared experience, every challenge overcome together. And so the impact rippled outward, touching lives that never even knew the original source. A great-great-grandchild who chose to fight for their own happiness rather than settle for what was expected, echoing Zelda's courage in leaving St. Louis. A distant cousin who became a sheriff in another state, inspired by stories of Asher's integrity and dedication. A family friend who decided to give love another chance after heartbreak, remembering that Zelda had been hurt before meeting Asher, but had been willing to trust again. These were the true measures of a life well lived. Not in accolades or achievements, though Asher and Zelda had those too, but in the quiet ways they made the world better, one interaction at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one choice to love well at a time. On what would have been their 150th wedding anniversary, the town of Bentonville held a special commemoration. The mayor gave a speech about the importance of remembering the pioneers who had built the community, and specifically about how Asher and Zelda Jameson represented the values the town still held dear: courage, integrity, education, and love. Dozens of Jameson descendants attended, some traveling from across the country to be there. They stood together in front of the historical marker near the old schoolhouse, linking hands and feeling the connection to ancestors they had never met but who had shaped their lives nonetheless. The youngest was a toddler bouncing on her mother's hip, too young to understand but already part of this legacy. The oldest was Samuel's granddaughter, now in her 90s, who remembered her grandfather's stories about his parents with perfect clarity. "They loved each other until the very end," she told the gathered crowd, her voice strong despite her age. "And beyond it, I believe. Their love was the kind that does not die because it was built on something real and true. They showed all of us what was possible when two people commit to each other completely, when they choose to be partners in every sense of the word. That is their greatest gift to us, greater than any material inheritance. The knowledge that this kind of love exists and the courage to seek it for ourselves." As the sun set over Bentonville that evening, casting golden light over the old schoolhouse and the cottonwood tree and the streets where Asher had walked his rounds for 32 years, it felt like the town itself was remembering. Remembering a sheriff who had offered his canteen to a dusty traveler and found his soulmate. Remembering a schoolteacher who had chosen principle over comfort and found happiness beyond her dreams. Remembering a love story that had proven that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest acts of kindness. And somewhere, in whatever place exists beyond this world, perhaps Asher and Zelda were together still, watching over the town they had loved and the family they had created, smiling at the legacy they had left behind. Perhaps they were walking hand in hand through fields of wildflowers, young again but with the wisdom of all their years together, still choosing each other, still loving each other, still grateful for that dusty June day in 1878 when everything changed. Because that is what true love does. It endures. It transcends. It transforms ordinary moments into something extraordinary, simple gestures into profound connections, two separate lives into one shared journey that continues long after the physical bodies have returned to dust. Asher and Zelda Jameson had lived that truth every day of their 50 years together. And in doing so, they had created something that would never truly die. A story of love that would inspire generations, a legacy of devotion that would outlast time itself, and a reminder that sometimes all it takes to change your entire life is being brave enough to offer your canteen to a stranger and open your heart to the possibility of love. Their story was complete, their ending happy and closed, all threads resolved. They had found each other, built a life together, raised a family, served their community, and loved each other faithfully until death parted them. And even then, they remained together in memory, in legacy, in the eternal bond they had forged through years of choosing each other every single day. It was, in every sense, a life well lived and a love well loved. And that, ultimately, was the best ending anyone could hope for. Not a fairy tale perfection, but a real and honest and beautiful journey shared with the person who made everything worthwhile, from that first dusty meeting to the final peaceful goodbye, and beyond into whatever comes next. The story of Sheriff Asher Jameson and schoolteacher Zelda Rayburn, who became the Jamesons of Bentonville, Arkansas, was finished. But the love that inspired it, the courage that defined it, and the legacy that grew from it would continue on, touching lives and warming hearts for as long as people believed in the transformative power of true love and the importance of choosing kindness, even in the simplest of moments.